Hello and welcome to A Long Look with me, John. In today's episode, it's time to step beyond the battlements and walk straight into the beating heart of medieval power. Because a castle wasn't just stone walls and towers, it was a world, a community, a machine of hierarchy, labour, politics, entertainment, loyalty, fear and ambition. And today, we're taking a long look at the people who actually lived inside these walls. The most important person in any castle wasn't the biggest knight or the strongest soldier, it was the owner. A king, a great lord, a knight rising through the ranks, or sometimes the lady of the house herself. But they often didn't live in their castles full-time, far from it. Kings of England owned dozens of castles, some of them never even saw half of them. Powerful noble families could own vast estates across the country, or even across multiple countries. Take Countess Joan de Valence, a formidable medieval widow with serious political clout. She travelled with a retinue so large it practically was a moving castle. When she arrived at Goodrich Castle in 1296, she turned up with a procession of carts and wagons, over 50 horses, 194 followers. Can you imagine being in this castle in the year 1296 and nearly 200 people marching up to your walls? I can only imagine the poor staff in that castle being in full panic mode, scrubbing floors, preparing rooms, getting food prepared, accommodation, a hive of medieval activity. Inside, the lord or lady had private apartments, not just a bedroom but a whole suite, including a reception chamber, a private chapel, and even a medieval ensuite loo, built right into the wall, dropping waste directly outside. Some castles even had a castle within a castle. The Earls of Northumberland at Warkworth Castle built a great tower with its own hall, chapel, kitchens, cellars and bedrooms, a private royal-like residence that could be defended even if the outer fortress fell. Of course, these luxury spaces weren't just for comfort, they were for power. The Lord's presence made a castle the centre of administration. From here, he controlled lands, judged disputes, negotiated marriages, settled rents, and held court. Large lordships could stretch so far that no owner could visit them regularly. Deputies, stewards, and trusted retainers managed distant estates. Royalty in particular ruled land across regions, and in some periods even across borders. And the lady of the castle? Far from being a passive figure, she held enormous domestic and administrative authority. She ran households, controlled her own dower lands, and could, and often did, command castles in her husband's absence. Widows like Joan de Valence, Maud de Barros, and Katrina Sforza, as shown here, were political actors, builders, patrons, and formidable power brokers, all deserving their own video. Castles look mighty, but without soldiers they're nothing more than stone shells. In peacetime, the garrison was often tiny. A dozen men, sometimes fewer, commanded by a constable or castellan. Enough to operate the gates, patrol the walls, keep robbers and opportunists at bay. But when war came, everything changed. At the Great Siege of Dover Castle in 1216, the English packed the place with 140 knights and possibly up to 1,000 sergeants, enough to turn the entire fortress into a buzzing hive of armour, arrows and organised chaos. These soldiers fought with swords, spears, axes and maces, longbows shot through tall cross-shaped arrow hoops, crossbows fired from smaller, deadlier slits. Rocks and timber dropped from machicolations, and by the 14th and 15th centuries, early cannon. As I'm sure we can imagine, sieges were not glamorous. They were long, brutal, starving affairs. At the siege of Kenilworth Castle in 1266, defenders survived on horses, dogs, cats, rats, even boiled leather belts before finally surrendering. Medieval chivalry had limits, but sometimes not many. And of course, without servants. The castle didn't run, it didn't feed, clean, or function. Countess Joan de Valence alone had nearly 100 servants at Goodrich Castle, and that was considered normal for a noble household. They came in strict layers. This was especially important when the household staff consisted of both nobles and commoners. The upper servants were often important barons in their own right, most often given the title for the prestige, but had become too great themselves to perform their household tasks as a matter of routine. There was fierce competition and rivalry for these positions. A steward was the lord's right hand in managing the estate. His word carried weight, second only to the lord and lady. Under him, the comptroller of the household, which is an ancient position in British royal households. Normally, the second ranking member of the Lord Steward's department after the treasurer of the household. Then there's the chamberlain, who oversaw the Lord's private chambers, such as clothing and treasury. Because of his access to the Lord's personal quarters, he was trusted with sensitive matters and often became a close advisor. You then had the treasurer, who kept accounts and stored written records, the keeper of the Privy Seal, who was responsible for the king's small personal seal, which was used to validate letters issued by the king, the butler, who oversaw wine and ale, head groom or the marshal, who had the responsibility for the stables, horses, and sometimes the military organisation, and of course chaplains responsible for spiritual life. These were influential people in court who could wield real authority. You would also have the children of elite families present, known as pages and damsels, who served while learning etiquette, reading, writing, music, and noble manners. Medieval etiquette books warned them to not wipe your nose on the tablecloth, don't spit on the floor, and to always be aware of the hind parts of guns blasting, which is a polite way of saying, don't fart on your betters. Well, I certainly wouldn't make a good page. I for one support farting on people who think are my betters. Then we have the yeoman, the original middle class. In medieval and early modern England, a yeoman was a member of a social class ranking between the peasantry and the landed gentry. Two groups of yeomen are listed: yeomen of the king's chamber and yeomen of the offices. Both groups are listed under officers and ministers of the house and their retinue. The separation into two groups seems to follow the contemporary social distinction between noble and common yeomen, who share the same rank. The yeoman would be expected to wear the Lord's livery every day in the presence of the Lord. His rank entitled him to even dine in the Great Hall. Then we come to the ordinary servants, the serfs that would be present on the Lord's land. They were the backbone of the castle. They were the laundresses, the scullions, the messengers, stable hands, cooks, spit boys, charcoal burners, and, finally, the gong farmer. Arguably the worst job in the medieval times. We'll get there. They slept wherever they could find space and worked from dawn until dusk. But they were fed well and wore the Lord's colours, making castle service a prized job. But the roles, and much more importantly, the social hierarchy between these roles varied hugely. Each task had a person, and each person had a rank. If anyone worked harder than the soldiers, it was the cook. At Goodwich Castle, the head cook, Isaac of the Kitchen, fed up to 200 people twice a day. Meals included beef, pork, mutton, venison from the castle hunts, rabbits, peacocks, swans, larks, herons, oysters and salmon. Records show that the castle cooks could use up to 24,000 herons in 3 months. With no refrigerator, winters meant salted or dried food. That's where Richard the Sorcerer came in. Yes, a real medieval job title, who used powerful imported spices to make salted meat edible and, more importantly, to show off the wealth of the household. Kitchens were hot, loud, chaotic, and essential. Fat from cooking was reused for everything, even candles. And the kitchen was locked at night so that greedy little servants wouldn't sneak in and eat the drippings. At a medieval court, entertainment wasn't optional, it was expected. Minstrels, jugglers, dancers, poets, and storytellers filled great halls during feasts. Edward II's knighting celebration hosted hundreds of performers, including Matilda Makejoy and Reginald the Liar. And then there were jesters, professional fools employed full-time. Henry II had one called Roland the Musical Farter, who performed every Christmas in exchange for land. Yes, land. Jesters weren't idiots. They were clever, sharp-tongued, and often the only ones allowed to mock powerful men. But even they had limits. When the French jester Triboulet went too far, he was sentenced to death. Asked how he'd like to die, he replied, of old age. He was pardoned. And now we go on to possibly the worst job in the castle, the gong farmer. Medieval toilets were simple. A hole in a wooden or stone seat that dropped straight down, sometimes into a moat, sometimes into a pit, or sometimes just onto the ground below. And someone had to clean it out. Enter the gong farmer, armed with a shovel, buckets, and a strong stomach. He emptied cesspits, often at huge risk. One unfortunate gong farmer, Richard the Raker, drowned in a cesspit in 1325. Because of the risk and the smell, gong farmers were surprisingly well paid, but they lived on the edge of society, for obvious reasons. Beyond warfare and domestic life, castles were psychological weapons. Everything from battlements to gardens were designed to project wealth, chivalry, prestige, legitimacy, and the owner's relationship with the monarch. To crenellate a building, meaning to build a wall with battlements, required royal permission. It wasn't just a defensive feature, it was a status symbol, a badge of elite identity. Castles have been compared to cathedrals as monuments of pride. They towered over landscapes, leaving a legacy for everyone who lived under their shadow. As one historian put it, and I quote, "The castle, as a large and imposing structure in the landscape, evoked emotions attachments, and memories for those who built it, worked in it, lived in it, and even those who passed it daily. But of course, life wasn't all battles and administration. The castle was also a stage for romance, politics, and alliances. Marriage among the elite wasn't about love, it was about land. Girls married in their teens, boys waited until they came of age. Courtly love, or rather the chivalric ideal, celebrated restrained, often secret admiration between noble lovers. Knights fought in tournaments wearing a lady's token. Love stories like Tristan and Isolde echoed throughout castle halls. And women? Some were far more influential at a time when the majority of women had no rights at all. They managed estates, oversaw households, influenced architecture and design, acted as patrons of art and literature, and commanded castles when widowed or acting for absent husbands. Castle life was a strict, class-based system shaped by both men and women, by politics, by ambition, and by the constant dance of duty and power. Thank you so much for joining me as we explored life inside a medieval castle. I do hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Until next time, from a long look, take care.